I'm Mark Galeotti. I'm an honorary professor at University College London and also the director of the Russia-focused consultancy Mayak Intelligence.
Mark, we've been talking to you since the start of this war. Firstly, I've got to ask, do you feel like this is going to be the end of it? Are we nearing the end?
I'm not yet sure if I'm willing to go so far as to be optimistic, but I think in fairness we are closer than we have been at any point since February 2022. We'll just have to see how it plays out. But as I say, I'm kind of optimistic that I might get optimistic.
And at this stage, does it feel like Putin has effectively won?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to give that awful answer of yes and no. Look, compared with his initial goals, which were, after all, to subjugate all of Ukraine, to install some kind of puppet regime, and to retain the country in his sphere of influence, Putin has not won, is not going to win. On the other hand, clearly at the moment, in terms of the current situation on the ground and the diplomatic process, Putin absolutely is winning. He's reaching the point where it looks conceivable that he may well extricate himself from this ghastly, bloody war, which is, after all, doing terrible damage to the Russian economy and the political structures, and yet be able to claim a triumph. Be able to claim that he faced down all of the West, that he took the areas that he needed to from Ukraine, and that basically he's building a new security order.
So much of that sense of triumphalism seems to come from the summit that took place in Alaska the other day. That there'd been such fanfare, there'd been so much sort of tough talk on both sides before Putin arrived. Take us back to what actually unfolded there.
Look, on the one hand, summits tend not to be knocked together in the course of a week. They tend to be the result of, firstly, a very long, drawn-out period of negotiation, the so-called Sherpas getting together to work all the details out, so that by the time the heads of state meet, essentially everyone knows what the outcome's going to be, and everyone has had a chance to prepare. In this case, of course, with Trump, it's the other way round. So we had this hurriedly knocked together so that, part of it was all great pomp and circumstance, the red carpet being unrolled for Putin, an optic that he must have been very, very happy to see, and other parts of it clearly being sort of hurriedly sort of slammed together. I mean, to start with the delegations, because in some ways the delegations tell us a lot precisely about how both sides saw this unfolding. I mean, Putin brought a delegation which included, his very, very experienced, very veteran Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, another veteran of the Russian Foreign Service, his foreign policy advisor Yuri Ushakov, and his defense minister Andrei Belousov. But the interesting thing was the other two guys who were there were his finance minister Anton Siluanov and a Harvard-educated Russian who is head now of essentially the government investment fund, Kirill Dmitriev, who has been very much the fluent Western-speaking sort of face of much of the negotiations. And again, it speaks to the fact that from Trump's point of view, economics really are at the heart of everything else. And likewise, if you look at Trump's delegation, yes, of course, there was his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, there was the head of the CIA, John Ratcliffe. But otherwise, the three people, Steve Witkoff, who'd been his sort of main representative in negotiations in Moscow, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutwak. Again, very much economics rather than geopolitics heavy.
That does feel surprising for an occasion like this.
Well, not in Trump world. I mean, I think, yes, if this had been the Biden era, we would have seen a very different sort of composition of these delegations. But then again, probably in the Biden era, we wouldn't have had a summit like this in the first place. The interesting thing is, it tells us also something of what he wanted to achieve. We tend to assume that if Putin won at the summit, then Trump lost. I'm not convinced that Trump did lose, because what's clear is that Trump doesn't really care about Ukraine. He cares about settling this conflict, not least because he had pledged himself that he was going to end it in 24 hours, if you recall. But otherwise, this is about America establishing itself as, the preeminent global power, and also about finding economic opportunities. So this is actually how Trump's foreign policy tends to work, and Putin understood that well enough to play to it. But the ultimate point was that what came out of this, it does seem to be clear that Well, first of all, Putin managed to convince Trump of one of his absolutely crucial points, which is that there will be no ceasefire before there is a peace agreement. See, up to now, the Western position was you stop the fighting and then you can talk. Now, this was always a non-starter, because as far as Putin's concerned, he's winning on the battlefield. Why should he stop that, lose the momentum, in order for talks to maybe happen that maybe will get somewhere? So, in some ways, Trump frankly has just recognised the inevitable. But then the actual shape of this, again, this has emerged in bits and pieces, and it now seems to be that Putin is demanding a big chunk, the remaining piece of the Donetsk region, about 30% of it, in return for essentially being willing to freeze the rest of the front line. Now, there's going to be lots and lots of devil in the detail. Again, this is the thing about Trump's backward-forwards approach to negotiation. But nonetheless, for the first time, I would say, we at least have some kind of proposal on the table that you can haggle about, you can argue over, but nonetheless, we do actually have negotiations in a way that we'd not had in the past.
And Mark, I know you've been watching the Russian media since this summit happened. I mean, how has this gone down? What's the reaction been out there? Do they see this as a big triumph?
Absolutely. The interesting thing was before the summit, there was a lot of expectation management going on. There was a lot of suggestions that we're not expecting there to be any kind of real immediate settlement of the Ukraine crisis, but this is a chance really to start rebuilding our relationship with the United States. So everyone was bracing themselves for, I wouldn't say a bad summit, but a mediocre one. Now, though, I mean, the metaphorical fireworks are blazing out of every page. This is absolutely being heralded as a triumph, but it's being heralded as a triumph on the Ukraine front, also in terms of the potential for a relationship with the United States, but also the wider optics. The idea that the attempt to isolate Russia is dead. That the sight of Putin stepping on the red carpet in an American airbase. Even there was a point in the actual summit where there was a flyover by a stealth bomber and 4 F-22 Raptor stealth fighters, which some people presented as a kind of American flex, an attempt to intimidate him. That, to the Russians, is actually a sign that the Americans are basically treating this like a full-blown state visit.
Oh,
so
wow.
I think from their point of view, they are very happy. And, just talking to Russians since then, the number of them who are actually wondering now whether or not the days in which they couldn't fly directly to Europe and that their bank cards wouldn't work and all that kind of thing because of sanctions, they are already beginning to wonder, well, at what point is this going to pass? So there's a chance for dashed hopes, but nonetheless, at the moment, everyone seems to be very happy with progress.
And that is remarkable. As you say, there was a lot of expectations management before the summit started. There was talk of increased sanctions, potentially, if the summit didn't go to plan, if there wasn't a ceasefire. Instead, there isn't a ceasefire, and people are already thinking that Russia is coming in from the cold. How badly did this go for the Americans? I mean, I mentioned the printouts that were found over the weekend. Clearly, there were plans for a big, lavish lunch. Didn't happen. The press conference, Vladimir Putin began speaking before Donald Trump could get a word in. There were no questions. This didn't quite go to plan for them, did it?
No, and to be perfectly honest, Trump did seem quite tired. And okay, so he's 7 years older than Putin, but Putin had come from a long flight from Moscow, stopping off in Magadan in the Russian Far East. But nonetheless, Putin clearly was the one who was essentially leading the event, not just the press conference, but he looked much more vigorous when they were meeting on the red carpet. He sort of hopped in to share a ride in the Beast, the presidential limousine, and the suggestion is, and it's just a suggestion at the stage, but in fact the reason why it was cut short was, well, from Putin's point of view, he had got the elements, the framework already in place that he wanted, and that frankly Trump was exhausted and didn't really have it in him for a further round of talks and a posh dinner and all that kind of thing. So I think in that respect, yes, I think the sort of the optics and the substance both very much coincided to paint Putin as a successful one. And the fascinating thing is, you mentioned that in the press conference it wasn't really a conference. that Putin got in first, he also had the last word. There is this nice point that, Putin wouldn't be Putin without a bit of snark. So even while he's being terribly nice to Trump, right at the end, when Trump sort of talks in vague terms about a future meeting, Putin jumps in, speaking in English. He doesn't really speak much English, but he clearly speaks the stuff that he needs to, saying, next time in Moscow, very much putting Trump on the spot.
Yeah.
And again, it's that little kind of dominance games that Putin tends to enjoy. And the fact that he felt comfortable enough to be able to do that with Trump, again, suggests that he generally was very happy with how things had gone.
A lot of what was said, was basically being understood via live translation. Do you think we understood, the Russian perspective well enough? Is this a firm agreement now that they've come to?
No, this is just the start. I mean, there was interesting, because you mentioned the translation. This is always the danger of the immediate translation, that sometimes nuance gets missed. And in particular, there was one line in that translation which was rendered as Putin saying, talking about agreements, which sounds like something that you'd almost imagine that there'd be a piece of paper somewhere with bullet points or whatever. Now, instead, he used not the Russian word соглашение, which is what you'd expect for an actual agreement, but понимание, which essentially means understandings. It's a much looser thing. So what Putin was more or less saying is, roughly, we're on the same page, rather than we actually have an agreement. But the interesting thing is that what has emerged since has actually suggested that, in fact, things were rather more advanced than that. And the fact that sort of Trump immediately went on to his sort of pet social media site, Truth Social, to say no ceasefire, but instead a peace treaty. In other words, something that very much echoes Putin's talking points, and that this whole business of the Donbass, we say swap, I mean, there'll be very small territories that the Russians have conquered in some other regions that would be given back to the Ukrainians in return for this great 6,000 square mile swath of Donetsk region. But again, actually suggests that, whether at the summit or in separate conversations, things had moved rather further than at first seemed the case.